Welcome to Richer Soul, Clement Decrop. It's great to have you join us today.
Thanks for having me, Rocky. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I'm excited to learn from you. We always like to start at the beginning. What was it like when you were growing up, and how much did your family and school teach you about money?
Great question. So, growing up, I was born in Belgium, then I moved to Spain when I was around 3, and then I moved to the United States around 6. So, growing up was a little tumultuous, just moving around, making new friends, and all that fun stuff. But I think money really came in the form of like a reward system for doing well in school. It wasn't a lot of money, but like $1 to $5 for like report cards. If you get an A, you get $5. If you get B, 4, 3, 2, 1 for below that. And I think that kind of incentivized me to do well in school, right? Just to make more money and do better. And when you're a kid, $5 is all you could ask for. Save a couple of those up, buy a $40 video game back in the day. So that's kind of how I grew up and really got exposed to money. And I think that really helped build a foundation for how I value money now.
And we'll chat about that. You had a little bit of a immigrant story as well, correct?
Yeah, so coming here at the age of 6 was definitely interesting. I remember my first thought was that everything in the United States is big, because when you're when you're in Europe, like stores are small, they're in the wall, everything is nice and tight, and then you move here, you're in JFK, and you're just like, wow, everything is just massive. And it was definitely a steep learning curve, especially just learning the language, and then learning the customs. And so it took me a couple months to learn that. Thankfully, I was young, and learning a new language when you're young is much easier than learning a new language when you're older. Um, so thankful for that. But it's been an interesting experience, from like people teasing you as like, oh, you don't know how to speak English, to going back to France and then having an accent from learning how to speak English. So it's like you never have like a true home or identity, from like a citizenship standpoint. But you know what? It's all fun and games. So I'm grateful for the experiences I've had so far.
And I guess you were young. Did you really notice much of a difference in just in the way of life between the two places, or
Yeah. So I've been fortunate enough to go back to Europe and do some work there for my internships. And it's a lot more um, laid back there, I would say, where work isn't the main priority, especially on the East Coast. You look at people are just working and grinding all the time. And it's like a lifestyle. You put work before other things. And I think that's a very kind of American culture. I think Japan, you kind of see some similar traces of that as well. Um, so I think that was one of the biggest things I found. But growing up, not much. You're a kid, and kids are kids wherever you go. They'll just make different jokes about different things or have different idioms. But for the most part, I think it's when I got older that I started to appreciate the differences.
nice? So that early kind of start in money, and then you kind of learned a little bit more about money as you got older, and that kind of really got you going. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So my first job was as a lifeguard, and to this day, it's still the best job in the world. You just sit on a chair, tan all day. Sign me up. Um, so worked as a lifeguard, and I think that was a good first stepping stone in learning about how to manage your own money, how to save your own money. But then, like as college progressed, started getting a job, worked at IBM in consulting, and started doing the 9 to 5 like everybody does. I just kind of grew tired a little bit, because the money was coming in and I was saving, but I wasn't happy, right? I think it's like a common story you hear every day now, like just people not happy with their jobs. So, like we were talking about a little bit before, I listened to a guy named Naval Ravikant. And for those of you who don't know, he's the CEO of AngelList. And he's a guru in his own right. And he spit some wisdom where he said, you got to do something that'll make you money while you sleep so that you can free your time. And so from there, I looked at money differently, where wealth isn't all about money, right? Wealth is in the mind. And if you're able to free up your time, that's kind of when you have the most amount of wealth. So for me, the emphasis wasn't as much on money when I started in like my mid 20s, and shifted over to more so like wealth, time, and overall health.
And I think that's a big part of what we talk about. You learn the lesson early that money wasn't going to make you happy. Um, and you kind of threw in their health as well. And too many people give up their health in this country to build wealth, and it all goes in circles. Naval did write a great piece. I think it's called How to Get Rich Every Single Time. And it's just systematically how to think about building wealth. And it's not really about personal finance at all. It's about how do you make yourself valuable and how do you provide value and build out systems and processes so that you can work less and make more, which is my favorite subject. How do I make more money without having to work 80 hours a week? Because I think that's what everyone thinks of is, oh, I have to trade my time for money. And Naval is kind of very much against that whole concept. And I know he actually had a lot of struggles in trying to put his viewpoints out as well, more so on the spiritual side and the life side and so forth, just because of what society does.
Yeah, and that kind of reminded me of the book Tim Ferriss's 4 Hour Work Week, right? It's in the Tim Ferriss and Naval are good friends too, and the whole concept of you don't have to kill yourself to make money, right? You can set up those systems in play to make you money while you sleep, and that was kind of the goal. So we released the book, and then after the book, started releasing kind of derivatives of the book in certain sort of meditation cards. So we have 2 card decks right now on Amazon, and we have the third one, Mindful Match, that's coming out in a couple months, which is like a Cards Against Humanity type game. And those are great because it's like you do the work up front, you let it go out on Amazon, and then you reap the rewards. You do a couple hours a week, but then you still get paid. And I think setting up those systems and processes in place where you don't have to be on top of it all the time, 24/7, makes life a little more enjoyable.
It does. I mean, you have to have the freedom to do what you want, and it takes time to build that. And I think everyone can. They just have to think it through and figure out how to do that. So, what inspired you to write the book, The Idea Space: The Science of Awakening Your Non-Self?
Great question. So, um, kind of going back to what I was talking about before, I got to do something that'll make me money while I sleep. And I could code, but I was more interested in reading. So I was like, what do I write a book? Let's just see what happens. And so I decided to write about things that I thought withstood the test of time, right? I wanted to write a classic just because if something is true today, I want it to be true 20 years, 30 years from now when people read it. And so I'm a bit of a nerd. And so I started writing about math, physics, and history. I thought those were like the big 3 domains that withstood the test of time. And after writing the first draft of like 700, 800 pages, I was like, what is the common thread amongst all this? And it was this concept of like an idea space, which is a mental model for your mind based in physics. And so I edited the whole thing from the scratch and went back down and did a couple rounds of iterations and got it down to like 250, 300 pages, a lot of pictures and a lot more digestible format.
Now, you said it was kind of history, science, and math, but yet there's a whole bunch of humanities in there. When did that come into play? Like, how did that creep into the book?
Yeah, another great question. So for me, I was always studying science when I grew up. I loved math and physics and chemistry. You name the science, I was all about it. But as I got older, I realized that for how good modern physics was, it had yet to provide a sustainable model for the mind, just to describe it, right? Like how does our mind relate to the universe at large? And so I just studied it, right? I bought the textbooks that they teach at Harvard, MIT, Stanford. I talked to a couple physics professors that were kind enough to speak with me, and I just started kind of putting the building blocks together to see what the story was, right? I didn't expect to find anything. You know what I mean? Like I just was like, all right, this is what I know, and just started writing it all out, and then made a couple key observations, such as your idea space has zero measure, which means that it looks like nothing to everybody else. So if I got a ruler and I measured zero, I would get zero. If I got a ruler and I measured nothing, I would also get zero. So the two look the same, but there's a really foundational difference between zero and nothing, which we can talk about later on. But I think that was kind of like the genesis for the book, right? Just trying to apply the principles of mathematics to the mind so that we could describe it in the same way that we would describe stars or atoms.
Have you been able to do that? I mean, can you define like in its simplest terms, how do you define the mind like that? It's an elusive subject.
Yeah, and I think the beauty of science is that science is all about falsifiability, right? It's you can't say anything is true in science, right? So for instance, everyone thinks gravity is quote unquote true, right? And it's very useful, but Einstein was able to prove that gravity is an illusion caused by the curvature of space-time. So as Richard Feynman says, who was a great physicist, the more and more we study a law, the falser and falser it becomes. And so with the mind, you get this concept of an idea space, which is just an approximation for how the mind fits in within our current schema of general relativity. And so, building on the principles of Zen, you kind of see that your idea space is a topological space of your thoughts, emotions, sensations, perceptions, and the empty set. All sort of mental formations fall under some sort of those categories. And your idea space has two key properties. The first, it has zero measure, like we talked about, which just means it looks like nothing to everybody else. And the second is that it's uncountable, which means that it is impermanent. It is always changing. And a good quote that kind of summarizes uncountability is by Heraclitus, which said, "No man steps into the same river twice, for it is not the same river, and he is not the same man." So your mind is always changing. The world is always changing.
And I think, in the Harvard Grant study, that was my biggest aha that came out of that. They studied people from about 20 to 80s, 90s. And every 10 years, these people were vastly different. They might be diametrically opposed to who they were before in their beliefs in things. They didn't remember half the things they said 10 years ago, right? It was almost like they were different. It was essentially they were different people every 10 years. And what I've noticed is as you go through life, if you don't have that something to measure against or to look at, you don't notice the change because it's not relevant. It's like when you watch your kids grow up, you see them every day, they look the same every day, right? You don't notice the aging, but when you see a kid and you haven't seen them for 2 years, it's like, wow, you grew because there's that what was in your mind and then this new thing enters. Whereas I think our ideas and thoughts change in that same way ever so slowly and we don't notice the difference.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think in today's society, especially in the Western world, there's a lot of emphasis around like who you are. Like you are Rocky, I am Clement. These are our personalities, and we put ourselves in these buckets. And in the Zen tradition, when you do such a thing, it only creates suffering, right? Because you're attaching yourself to a concept or an idea that is always changing. And that's kind of like trying to grab water in your hand, right? If you try to grab water, it's just going to flow everywhere and it's going to be a mess. And you'll be like, no, I wanted the water. So, yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying. And I think it's super important too. And the idea of building wealth, um, that it's not always all about the money, right? It's like being able to reflect on the times and say, you know what, like if you have a kid, like seeing your kid grow and like a skill that they were not good at first, show the frustration in their eyes, and then a couple of weeks later, they're loving to do that activity every single day, right?
It's funny because you mentioned the name, and I really like that was kind of an eye opener to me. You don't pick your name, you don't pick your sex, you don't pick where you're born, you don't pick so many things, and yet we judge people on things that they had no control over. That was essentially assigned to them by the universe, and it's kind of funny how that comes to be. So you talk about the idea space. So what exactly is this idea space?
Is the trivial solution to Einstein's field equation. And that's kind of a lot of mumbo jumbo. But going back to what we were talking about earlier, it's just a mechanism to describe our mind using the same principles as physics, specifically general relativity. And so when I say it's an exact solution to Einstein's field equation, what I mean is that Einstein's field equation describes how matter basically deforms space-time to create the illusion of gravity. So a great example of this is like, imagine you have a taut trampoline that represents space-time. If I put a bowling ball on the trampoline, the bowling ball is going to dip and the trampoline itself is going to dip, right? Then you can put marbles around the bowling ball and they'll gravitate around the bowling ball. In a similar way, stars deform space-time, and then planets revolve around the star, creating the illusion of gravity. But since an idea space has zero measure, right, it has no direct effect on space-time. So it would just basically be like putting an idea on top of a trampoline. Nothing would happen, right? And you can kind of test this for yourself too by holding something in your hand. For instance, I can hold my AirPod case, right? Clearly you can see it. I can see it. I can feel it. It's a thing. But then if I close my eyes and bring to mind a mental image of what I'm holding, I'll see a picture of it in my mind. But Rocky, can you see the mental image of the earphone case that's in my mind?
I can. I can read minds. Did you know that?
There you go. Beautiful. But yeah, so that's kind of like the idea of the idea space. Is that it's the trivial solution to Einstein's field equation in the sense that an idea has no direct effect on space-time. And again, it's not a definite truth, right? With the advancements in AI and everything, we'll definitely get to an age where we are able to read each other's minds fluidly. But until then, it's kind of the best approximation we have to describe the human existence.
Do you think we'll get to that point where we can read other minds, or do you think it'll be AI kind of looking at a person and guessing what they're thinking in a sense of, I don't know.
I think so. A lot of the AI today is like predictive, like what's the next character that's going to be populated, right? That's kind of what ChatGPT does with large language models. And I think it'll be something really similar, and where it'll be like almost it's impossible to capture the human experience. It's so unique, and we have tried for millennia. But like, even if I'm able to like read your thoughts, I won't be able to read like the sensations, the emotions that those thoughts kind of trigger. And maybe they will one day, and I'm totally wrong. But that's such a delicate problem to overcome. Maybe Neuralink will change all that with chips in our brains, and we'll evolve into a cyberpunk world. Who knows? But yeah, it definitely is a challenge.
And you didn't really talk about this in the book, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the amount of electrical energy and power in our brains is kind of astronomical. I don't know if there's a way yet to tap into it, but the amount of that going on is pretty amazing to think about.
Yeah, and how efficient it is, right? You have like billions of nerves just communicating with each other at all times, just so effortlessly. And like we don't even have to think about it, right? Everything is just done subconsciously. It's not like I'm sitting here, I'm like, all right, nerve 2532. You're gonna synapse right now. You know what I mean? It's done so effortlessly, and definitely like calls for some form of like gratitude just to be able to enjoy life and enjoy it in a healthy way.
Now, it's funny because we're talking about science, we're talking about the brain, and yet there was a large focus in the book on the breath. Why was that?
Yeah, so one of the lenses that I applied to the book was the lens of Zen, because talking again, for how good modern physics is, it has yet to provide a sustainable model for the mind. And so you get this sort of division where you have the science of objects, which are things we can measure, like physics, chemistry, and biology. And then you have the science of the first person, which is kind of the science for how the mind works. And since we can't use the same tools in such as like a ruler or a semiconductor to measure the mind yet, we have to use other tools, right? And that's kind of where meditation comes in. And Zen specifically spoke the most to me, but there's so many different forms of meditation, like transcendental meditation. You have breathing exercises, like you were mentioning. And I think across all the different types of meditation practices, the breath is always known as like the anchor, right? You have to inhale and exhale to breathe, otherwise you slowly die. And going back to what we were talking about before, right? Like no two breaths are the same. And I think that's really important because a lot of times in life you will get stressed, whether it's about money, your career, your life. But all of these are sort of what we talk about in the book is like an intersubjective reality or imagined reality based on Yuval Harari's Sapiens. And so this is only something that is real because you believe it to be real. And that kind of takes you away from what is actually real, right? Your health, your friendships, and your relationships. And so by focusing on the breath, you're really just able to come back into the present moment and start with a clear idea space, right? Talking about your idea space has nothing inside of it. When you focus on the breath, you start with beginner's mind. And I think it's a pace that's a lot less biased and allows you to accomplish more.
And it's weird because it's one of those things where if you get excited or something happens, it affects your breath. But in the same way, if you decide to affect your breath, you can change your mood. And so it's kind of a two-way signaling. One part is automatic, the other part you can actually take control of and bring about the change, which I don't know that there's any other autonomous things in our body that we have that kind of control over. In other words, I can't just say raise my heart rate. I mean, I have to run, but I can do it that way. But there's a lot of natural types of things going on in the body that we don't have. At least we haven't learned how to control. Maybe some people are more so better at that.
Yeah, maybe Wim Hof and his magical ability just to fight everything off that he comes across.
Well, that comes down to breath and how powerful breath is in that whole space of being able to fight disease, to deal with all these different things, and to control the body. So I think that is an idea space that we have not spent enough time exploring.
Yeah, and then I think just to like touch on one more thing that brought to mind is like with your breath, it controls your autonomous nervous system, right? Your fight or flight. And when you engage in deep breathing, you engage your parasympathetic nervous system, and that controls a lot of body regulations, like slowing down your heart rate. But when you do like fast breathing, then you activate your sympathetic nervous system, and your whole body works in a completely different way, right? So going back to your point, yeah, the body hacks directly against the breath.
So throughout the book, you start to bring about new terms. And one of them was Clopen. Can you explain this?
Yes, that is my favorite word ever, I think. So Clopen, if for the listeners, as you can tell, is a combination of closed and open. And in mathematical terms, Clopen is a set that is simultaneously open and closed. And we don't have to get into all the details of what open and closed mean, but essentially it is when two things that appear to be contradicting, like open and closed, are simultaneously true. So for instance, we can have a door that's open and closed, right? But you can't really have a door that's open and closed at the same time. But in life, there are a lot of Clopen opportunities. For instance, I think a great example is the dress. And the dress is a famous picture that I see black and blue when I look at the dress, but other people see white and gold, right? Like, are you familiar with the dress, Rocky?
I have. I think I see white and gold.
Yeah, so if it's the same picture we're looking at, right? But it's a completely different perception, right? And so life has so many of these different Clopen scenarios. And Erwin Schrödinger, I think, had a good quote where it's like, the opposite of a profound truth may as well be another profound truth, right? So I think a lot of times people in life are attached to their opinion, And as soon as you become too attached to something, you build a nest around it. And you don't open your eyes and opportunities to what may be the opposite or the other viewpoint. But the other viewpoint may be equally as valid. And I think whether you're building a business or just going about through life, I think that'll help you a lot because it'll just give you a different perspective on how to shape your business, how to go about making money, or how to go about building wealth. Uh, and hopefully bring you a perspective that you didn't see before, but ends up working in your favor.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of a concept. And it's along the lines of there is something that's true, and then there's the truth. So you can have a lot of things that are true, but in reality, they're kind of false. And I think that's what modern marketing gets away with. They tell you the true, but it's not. Yes, it's true, but it's not the truth. And it becomes that weird space, and it just that's what I thought of when you talked about that.
Yeah, well said. I mean, it's the same thing with we have our own perception of the truth, but what the truth may actually be is who knows, right?
And you talk about that in the book too, in the concept of we all have our own perception of what the sunset looks like.
Mm.
And yet we all think we see the same thing, and yet we don't. We see it from our vantage point. And the reality is what I call green might look what I call blue to you. But we have no way of knowing that, do we?
Yeah, and that's like the whole idea behind the Sunset Conjecture, right? And it's kind of the idea everyone has a unique perspective of the universe, and that may seem intuitively true on a surface level. And what the Sunset Conjecture aims to do is kind of provide a more rigorous hypothesis, right, for that. And all the Sunset Conjecture states is that everyone lives at the center of their own observable universe, which is a giant sphere centered on you where everything you see is in the past because it takes time for light to go from point A to point B because it travels at 186,000 miles per second. So, like the light you're seeing from the sun, you're seeing how the sun was 8 minutes ago. And then the second part of the conjecture is that at the center of it lies your idea space, unique to you, right? I can't see what's inside your mind, but I know Rocky can see what's inside mine since he has he's got the superpowers. Um, and that's kind of what makes life so beautiful. It's just unique for everyone.
It is. And it's funny because as I look back in life, when I was younger, there were no variation, wasn't the norm, right? There were 3 TV channels. Everyone got the same news. Like it wasn't like today where you have a million choices, so to speak. It was, and it's funny because even as I thought about it, it reminded me, I would say 50 years ago, it didn't matter whether you were wealthy or poor or middle class. Everybody pretty much ate the same way. Like they had the same kind of meals. There wasn't this massive variation that we tend to have today. And so it's really kind of opened that up. And now it seems everybody's fighting over whatever they see as their point of view, and they can't see anything else, which I
Which
guess
is where
that's just
Clopen
life.
comes in.
Yes, it does. So let's go a little bit deeper. One of the things that I really enjoyed in the book, it said, let go of any attachment to that thought. Once you do, you'll notice that the half-life of negative emotions reduces greatly. So how do you let go of attachment to the thought? Because I think that goes back to what we were talking about. People need to let go.
Yeah, there's one of my professors once said, growing up is the constant act of letting go. And I was like, oh, well said, sir, well said. So the concept of the half-life is in like physics or something like an atom will decay. It has a certain half-life before it decays. And so I first heard that when listening to Sam Harris. He was talking about as soon as you notice an emotion, emotions are weird, right? They just kind of take up your entire body. And really can throw you into a thought spiral. For instance, someone cuts you off in traffic, you're going to be upset, and the emotions of hatred and anger are going to tint your idea space, right? And all of your other thoughts will be sort of jaded. And so when you're able to just notice for that emotion for what it is, and usually that's identifying the thought that triggered the emotion. For instance, hey, that guy should not have cut me off, but in more coarse words. Then you're able to kind of let go of it because you know it's not anything else. It's not like, oh, something to do with your spouse or something to do with your kid that's angering you. It was the guy who cut you off. And then you're able to like delineate that line in your mind, which allows you to reduce the half-life of that emotion, right? It allows you to just see it disappear. As the Buddha said, whatever has the nature to arise has the nature to pass away.
I think Zig Ziglar tells a good story of that whole thing, from somebody cutting him off all the way through the whole workday to them coming home and kicking the dog or something. Like, one action creates the negative next reaction and so forth. And that was kind of the thing. In the past, that was just kind of the norm. And I think today people are realizing that you do have control over all these things. You can change your state. You have the ability to make those kinds of changes. Now, you had two great exercises in the book to combat, not like maybe that specific thing, but more general poor ideas. And you talked about negative visualizations and the last time meditation. Can you talk about those two?
Yeah, glad you picked up on those. Those were some of my favorites. So those are actually
See, I'm
stoic.
reading your mind. I told you.
Yeah, you're. Oh man. But yeah, so those are stoic principles, right? So the negative visualization is periodically throughout your day, intentionally bring to mind a negative thing. So, for instance, you're walking on the street, and for a brief instant, think to yourself, oops, what if I tripped and broke my arm? Don't linger on the thought of it for too long. But what that negative visualization allows you to do is understand what negative emotions look like when you bring them to mind willingly. And then from there, it allows you to it gives you a better, it's like practice, right? The more you practice in basketball shooting, the better you're going to be at shooting. In life, the more you're able to practice negative visualizations, the more gratitude you're able to build up. And then when something negative happens in your life, you're like, you know what? This is exactly like the negative visualization exercise I did before. And then the last time meditation, another stoic practice, is around imagining that it is the last time that you're doing something. For instance, the last time I'm talking to you, or the last time that I'm taking a breath. And what that does is it allows us to build a deeper sense of gratitude for what we're doing without getting distracted of what we have to do later on or what we did before that's bringing us here today. And so I think those two principles just help build resiliency that's super important for people, especially like when you want to build that wealth. I think, what's his name? The CEO of NVIDIA recently went to Stanford, right? And he told all of the students, I hope you suffer, right? Because out of some of that suffering can come a lot of resilience. And a lot of entrepreneurship, especially, is just grit, just grinding through the things that you don't want to do and that aren't fun, but at the end of the day, get you where you need to be. So there's two exercises. Yeah, great call out on those.
And so we talk about that a lot because the question is, when you build wealth, how do you raise kids with grit? And it is by allowing them to have to deal with building resilience and not having everything handed to them, having to struggle. Doesn't mean that, they have to have a horrible life, but if you can create that little bit of resistance that they have to learn to overcome, and that not everything is handed, then it helps to build that. And that was one of the biggest things I faced raising kids, because I knew they were going to grow up with money, and I've seen the bad outcomes because nobody teaches. Generally what happens is everyone wants, especially once you build wealth, you don't want your kids to suffer. And so it creates that negative feedback loop that is not good. And you have that. And I'm guessing, had you maybe not gone through some of the suffering as a kid, you might not have done some of the things that you did, or taken, the steps forward like you did. And so there's got to be that appropriate balance there.
So I'd love to hear like what's a good example of like something that you do with your kids to kind of help them build that perspective.
Um, so a couple of things. One, we always kind of had the philosophy that your parents are rich or poor. So you're going to have to figure it out, right? Not that we're going to hand you money. Um, the other thing is we're not into labels. We're not into all of this stuff. So our kids would wear generic clothes, even if they were hanging around with people whose kids were wearing the fancy stuff. And I think we taught them at a very early age. We gave them money and we taught them lessons on how to use it. But I think one of the most classic things was, when they're kids, back then we didn't have all the latest digital stuff. You got to watch the commercials on TV. And we would sit and we would watch a commercial and go, "You have that toy, right?" And they're like, "Yeah." I go, "Is it that fun?" And they're like, "No, because on the TV it looks amazing." And so they understood the concept that, hey, the purpose of a commercial is for them to take my money. And
Mhm.
so learning to turn off what society demands of them, learning that they don't need all of that, and kind of having the grit to just look at their friends and go, whatever. And they did, because, their friends are like, "I've never seen that brand of sneakers." They're like, "Yeah, whatever." Like, they didn't care, because they understood what the trade offs were. And there were points where they wanted stuff. And so you let them go buy it, but then you go, was it worth it? Like, yes or no? And so I think there's a little bit of that back and forth. And you have to create appropriate situations like that where it's not a given. So I think you also have to live your life in a way that you want them to. So if you're buying all the designer stuff and you're, treating people a certain way, and then your kids are going to do that because they don't care what you say, they care what you do. So you got to model it.
Yeah, very true. I feel like kids just want to be their parents in a way, right? When they grow up, like take the best of both of their strengths and build on their weaknesses and see what happens.
Yeah. Well, and they also want to rebel, and
Yes.
there is a point, and you have to realize, kids go through certain stages. And once you understand what the stages of development are, then you know what you have to do in that stage of development. And each one has its own thing. Um, and honestly, like I told my kid, my son still fights with me. I'm like, if you get into Harvard or MIT, I'm not paying the bill. You got to figure out how it's going to get done. If you're smart enough to go to college, you're smart enough to pay for it. And so we did have some of those fights, and they understood though, and they get it. But it's hard because it takes them a long time to realize,
Mm.
right? You gotta wait a long time to get the result. It's not, instant in this world.
Yeah, I feel like that's the one of the best lessons I've had so far in my life. Just like the idea of constantly building, where you do like 1% every day, and like I think it's like a classic graphic where you do like 1.01 to the 365 versus 99 to the 365. The 1.01 it goes to like 37, and then the 9.99 goes to like 0.98 or something, 0.97, and it just shows that like slow and steady wins the race. You do a little bit every day, and then you get a chance to look back on what you built, and it's there, and it's real.
You know what that reminds me? At the end of every school year, what we would do is we would look, okay, where did you struggle and what were your strengths? And so in the summertime, I'm like, hey, go focus a little bit on your strengths, push yourself up so that you can cruise through that part. And now let's focus on your weaknesses so that you have the time now because you cruised ahead on what was easy. Now you have the time to put into what the struggle is. And they would spend their summers learning. And yeah, they were okay with it, I guess, at points better than others, right? But then looking back, they're like, oh, now we see the outcomes of this, right? They really start to, because you don't see separation, I think, till about 14 or 15. And then like you can see the compounding blow out like you talk about, and kids be vastly divergent. Um, first, second, third, fourth grade, they're all relative. I mean, there is a spectrum, and I guess it depends. Unless your kid's way behind, that's different. Um, but then as they get older, it really, really does. And so this kind of come up to and this is kind of a longer quote in the book. It's important to see what social norms you engage with and tolerate, especially those that can be harmful or unskillful, like obsessively curating Instagram reels and now TikTok, right? Or relying on coffee or adhering to a strict schedule of eating 3 meals a day. By the way, that's proven to be unhealthy, but we can talk about that on another. So,
Yeah,
I mean, that kind of encapsulates what we've been talking about.
yeah, 100%. And I think life is weird, right? Like you're a kid and you just have this very naive and like innocent perspective on life, and then you get taught all of these things, and you're like, all right, that's the way the world is. But then some people come to a realization that, you know what, that's not it at all. And you have to unlearn a lot of the things that you had learned and keep the takeaways that were actually beneficial. And it's interesting because some people will have that realization in life and other people's won't. They'll just live their life continuing as is without really questioning the status quo or why they're doing the things they're doing, or kind of like, what is this? Like, like what is all this? It's like I think that's an important question to ask yourself every now and then. And especially with the social norms, just because when you're a kid, you're so influenced by the people around you that like I know just like based on the certain friend groups that you're in, you can be really smart, but just end up doing dumb things just because you're in those friend groups, right? And so being able to take that time to reflect, and the thing that's I think is important is that it doesn't matter what age you are, even if you're a kid or like older in life, you're still able to change um, and learn and do something different, and that can kind of help you get to where you need to be.
Well, and I think that's really true of kids. And I think that's why when kids leave high school and they go to college, all of a sudden the peer group dramatically changes. They might have been the big fish in the little pond, and all of a sudden, they're the little fish in the big pond, or they're finally around people of their, depending where they go to school, of their caliber or whatever. Um, Unfortunately, most people aren't picking school to learn. They're picking it for a variety of other reasons. And with the cost of college, that's a whole nother episode that
Yeah.
we've covered many times in the past. Um, but I think a lot of what I'll call them modern day philosophers say is most people are asleep.
Mm.
They're just
Yeah.
walking through life, accepting the programming and the norms that they've been given and never challenging it once, getting stuck in that pattern and being okay with it. And I guess that's okay too, because somebody has to do the stuff that none of us want to do.
And if, like you think about it, the way that the system is set up is like go to school until you're 21, and then good luck. And it doesn't foster much of that innovation or that willingness to try new things. And like I fell quote unquote victim to it, not really a victim, but like that was my life for a while. And for me, I think that it needed some sort of like triggering mechanism to like wake you up, right? Um, I don't know like how it was for you, but for me, there was just like different points, and I think one of the key ones was I was talking to this person, and she said that I wasn't a good person, right? And like we were just, it was like we had gone drinking that night, and it was late, and so like that's like the words came out. I don't know if the intentions were met, but like when someone says that to you, you kind of like reevaluate your life a little bit, right? You're like, everyone thinks you're a good person, right? But like statistically speaking, there's a spectrum where some people are better than the others, right? And being told point blank that you're not a good person is, I think, was like the triggering mechanism for me to just like sit down and evaluate everything. So I'm kind of thankful that those words were said, because it made me realize, like, all right, like what have I not been doing that's been good? What have I been doing where that makes like my people happy, that helps me have friends, and just kind of go from there. So hopefully people don't have an intense trigger that kind of like puts them off the deep end, but sometimes people do need a kick in the butt to wake them up.
Did you agree with their idea space about you?
No, I think it was really just in the moment. We were talking and it had been a long night. And so the words came out, they were said, but I think they were just said in the heat of the moment, right? And I don't
Mm.
take it personally. Like, she's still a good person and still wish her all the best. But it was good. Like, it helped me push me to where I am today. And I'm loving life. I just moved to Venice Beach, California, living a block from the beach. So I cannot complain about life whatsoever.
I get it. And I think the next quote kind of was, it summarizes this, is understanding that words, money, societal norms, laws, religions, the political systems, scientific theories, which you said are all, not really real, just our best guess, right? They all create a veil of illusion, and they essentially keep you from being awake, right? They close your eyes until you challenge and question everything. And it's really funny to like, and I think it's easier than ever to do it. All you have to do is just go look at a Twitter war or a social media thread, and you can see people. And sometimes I just laugh. I'm like, oh my, that's hilarious to just watch and see what people think or believe. Or maybe they're just poking. I don't know.
Yeah, well said. That's kind of like the key theme of the book, right? Like the veils of illusion, just understanding, like challenging your perception of what you think is true. So, like the book starts off with Clopen, the idea of something being closed and open at the same time. A lot of people would be like, that's not possible. But in math, it is. In math, this is the only domain where things can be true. Everything else is falsifiability. And so it'd be a good exercise for the listener just to sit down and really question what is real in your life, right? Like, is your job title real? Is the money you own real? Um, they're real in a very specific intersubjective reality sense. Like, money has value because we all believe it has value, right? But there's more real aspects, kind of like your health and your relationships, that should dominate your energy, for lack of a better word, right? Where you want to focus your awareness. And I think some of the best founders, some of the best entrepreneurs have been people who have kind of realized this and broken free from the status quo and done something that's completely radical, something completely different. We can look at kind of Bill Gates with Microsoft and the operating system, Elon Musk with making rockets that are reusable, right? That was like, I remember when I was a kid, I was just like, rockets are cool if they explode and then you don't reuse them. And now I'm like, they're just reusing them all the time. Like, I remember seeing a graphic of SpaceX and all the different launches they've done this past year, and it's incredible. And so to find that wealth, it's really a matter of questioning what is real and trying to build a product or a service that helps other people kind of realize that in themselves, whether it's through technological advances, coaching, or services. There's a lot of different ways to do it, and you just got to find your own.
What's been most helpful to you
In terms of what?
in terms of making that progress, in learning to put the veil down, to seeing, to not getting stuck in societal norms?
Yeah, I think you're going to love this one just based on your background. Like literally right behind you. Just reading. There's a great quote in Game of Thrones where George R. R. Martin says, "A man who reads lives 1,000 lives. The man who does not read only lives one." And so I'm a big nerd. I like to wake up in the morning and read textbooks on semiconductors, rockets, you name it. That's my cup of tea because it shows me what's true, right? And the art of possible. Same thing with math. But I also read like philosophical books, fiction. I'm currently reading Hail Mary right now. It's the same guy who did The Martian. And so it's like exposing yourself to different books is the best way to learn because you don't know what you don't know, right? And the beauty of a book is that someone spent a lot of time and effort crafting it and making sure that it's as correct can be. And so when you expose yourself to that, you can learn a lot. Even if you don't understand everything that's written, I'm sure from my friends tell me that when they read the idea space, there's some things they don't understand. But the ones that kind of power through it get the overall message. And I think that's kind of like the main key. You're not going to understand every detail, but as long as the overarching message is there, that's the key takeaway.
And the statistics on the percent of people who read once they leave college is pretty bad, even though there's a ton of bookstores or Amazon. It's funny how many people buy books, but how few people read them.
Yeah, and there's two good ideas that come from that. And if you've never read before, if you don't like reading, Naval has a good quote where it's read what you love until you love to read. So if you love playing Dungeons and Dragons, read some Dungeons and Dragon books, and eventually you'll like to read things like Profit First right behind you. And another idea is this concept of like the anti-library, where you have more books that you haven't read than you've read. And the whole idea there is just exposing you to the unknown unknowns. We talk about this a little bit at the beginning of the book in the framework, but these are just things that you don't know that you don't know. So for instance, if you were living in the year 1600, you wouldn't know that the idea of gravity existed, right? But then in 1687, Isaac Newton comes around and he goes, mic drop, here's gravity. And now it's a thing, right? Similarly with the idea space, it wasn't a thing, it was an unknown unknown, and now it's a known unknown, or maybe a known known in your idea space. So reading cannot you can learn so much reading. It's so important to just have in your life.
How did you come to this merge of kind of science and philosophy? Because that is coming back together. I think for a long time the two were at opposition, but now it's actually the scientists who are coming back and going, wait a minute, there's something to this, I'll call it religion space.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think it was just those were my two biggest interests at that point of time in my life, where I loved science and I was getting really big into meditation from the story I was telling you about. And it was really just an exploration. Like I didn't think that's what was going to come about, right? Like I didn't write the book be like, this is going to be the exact solution to Einstein's field equation. It's like, no, none of that whatsoever. It was just like, all right, these are interesting topics. Let's see what the story has to tell. And it was really fun. Just like writing is a fun process. You wake up, you write a couple pages, and then you get tired. You put it down, you think about it, you go to sleep, you wake up, you feel refreshed. You're like, oh, I know exactly where the story picks off. And you just keep writing the story. And I think that's kind of the key to storytelling in general. It's like not trying to overdo it. Like you may have some key kind of like milestones that you have in mind, but just let the story write itself. I think that's super important to do in life.
Since I'm a podcaster, I just let ChatGPT write my stories. I throw a whole bunch of stuff in there and go, make sense of this and make it sound good for me, please.
Yeah, I'm on the same boat. Life pre and post ChatGPT has been the same thing as life pre and post Google. So definitely a game changer.
It is definitely a game changer. What's your secret to living an abundant life?
Exercise and good nutrition.
What did you learn later in life that you wish you would have learned sooner?
That's a quote by Confucius, which is everybody lives two lives The second starts when you realize you only live one.
If you were to give an 18-year-old one specific piece of wisdom, what would it be?
Go read a book.
If people would like to learn more about you, get the book, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so everything's on my website, www.theideaspace.io, and the first chapter is free on there, so feel free to go on there and download it to get a taste of the idea space.
And we'll put that link in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Rocky. You've been a stellar host and so well prepared, and I have loved this conversation. Thank you so much.
You are most welcome. Thanks for checking out this unedited video of the Richer Soul podcast. You can find the full episode along with all the back episodes at richersoul.com. This podcast is brought to you by Profit Comes First, where we help business owners to have a more profitable and growing business so they can live the life of their dreams. Check that out as well wherever you listen to all this content.